and welcome to Cyber Sidekicks, your weekly cybersecurity podcast with me, Rory Duncan.
And with me, Christina Richmond. We're so glad you've joined us this week. We have an RSA wrap-up, the conference wrap-up today, don't we, Rory?
We do. It has been, is it almost 2 weeks? Oh, crikey, yeah. By the time this comes out, it'll be 2 weeks since we got back. I have recovered pretty much. Your voice has come back, Christina. So we feel as if we can actually talk about things now. I mean, I sounded like I was speaking out of a drain. You sounded like you were speaking through sandpaper. I mean, it was terrible. That last day was.
But we managed
terrible.
To carry on. We delivered 3 podcasts in video and audio just after the show. So, folks, if you haven't seen the videos, they're kind of fun and unique because we don't do them every week. So this will be back to our normal just audio, unless our listeners clamor for weekly video. You know, we're going to do audio. It's just, we think it's easier. We think it's also beneficial for you, the listener, because you can take us walking but let us know what you think and what you'd like.
Yeah, that would be great. And if you do say we should do it all video, then hair and
makeup. Well, that's really going to take you the hours.
Yeah,
right?
it
Not
will.
Me.
Or some kind of avatar or puppet in its place.
Oh, you keep talking about puppets.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll do puppets. I like that idea.
Yeah. That will be a special occasion for doing the puppets. So yes, Christina, let's chat about RSAC.
Yeah, and we do have a guest today. We have the inimitable Ross Young.
Yeah.
And we do introduce him when he comes on, so we'll leave that for the guest section.
Yes.
And we're excited to chat with him. He just released a book, so we'll talk about that with him. Stay with us. RSAC 2026 at a glance. Let's dive in. Rory, why don't you kick us off and tell us about who, what, when, where, why.
Yeah. So a few stats just to kind of orient people. And for those of you who weren't there, as Christina mentioned, there's videos. There's also a few shorts on our YouTube channel, just to give you a flavor of the experience. The theme this year was the power of community, which I know Christina will be talking about soon. And it very much felt like a community, even though there were over 43,000 attendees. And, the streets were packed and there were lines everywhere.
And the restaurants were packed. It's back. It's full capacity.
Yeah.
Really.
But I think it definitely is the case that you felt as if you were part of the wider security community. And, everybody you talked to practically there was going to the show. And, you strike up a conversation. People were quite happy to chat. So having said that, there was a lot of things we saw, a lot of things we couldn't see. We didn't really get a chance to go to the conference itself. There were 700 speakers, 570 sessions, more than 600 exhibitors, I think, if you include the kind of early stage, and over 100 countries represented. So this is, and I think this was your observation, Christina, 2026 back at peak RSAC intensity.
Yeah, it certainly was. The one keynote I wish I had seen, I mean, I always want to see all of them, and I don't typically get to any of them. But the one that I wanted to see, and someone sent me short clips of, was the Hugh Jackman wrap-up keynote. So he did a little Wolverine. Right. He did the Wolverine on stage. And he also talked about The Rock. Right. He was, bulking up, eating a lot of food that The Rock eats in order to become the Wolverine. But he also told a story about the kindness of, people helping him get to where he was and to portray that part. And he really made a point to talk about community. So the closing speaker, the Wolverine, really wrapped it up nicely, which is good. I think, the power of community had a bit of a twist, I think. On the surface, RSAC leaned heavily into human connection and resilience and shared responsibility. Those are key messages today. But underneath that, I thought was really an interesting subtext, which is community is not just humans anymore. right? It's across
Yeah.
AI systems, autonomous agents,
Mm-hmm.
and trust is no longer just interpersonal or organizational. It's also machine mediated.
Yeah.
So, that makes the hair on my arms
Yep.
stand up a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Community becomes a control plane problem. The human control plane, certainly, and the machine control plane. So the hair on my arm is literally standing up at attention at the moment, because I've joked that we're augmenting the machines, not the other way around.
Yeah.
But now I'm really seeing that it's both of us together, machine and human. This is scary to say. Not even an augmentation story, I don't think. It's community.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I just watched on Reddit a video of a guy who'd put two of these sort of talking trash cans next to each other, and they were literally having a conversation. But
really?
I could imagine, this coming for RSAC, there's maybe going to be a sideshow or an alt show, which would be the bots talking about technologies and so on, based on their experience. And we've seen it already in Maltbook, which was the kind of social platform.
I wonder what they're talking about in Maltbook post. I mean, they probably did it in the 2 seconds after the show. Would we have been a fly on the wall? That would have been interesting.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if it's happening at machine speed, it would be over. That was it. Oh, how was that? It? Having their conversations in microseconds. So yeah. But definitely, it does reflect a theme, which was this whole AI everywhere, right? Shifting from co-pilots, which is your assistants, your smart or kind of smart, maybe semi-dumb assistants, to agents. So it's this shift we saw that, yes, everybody's been talking about AI for a number of years because of generative AI, because of ChatGPT and everything that came after that. But it's switching to these, smart, fulfilling specific functions, autonomous agentic systems. So they're getting much more prescriptive about giving tasks to these agents. In other words, giving them decision-making authority, but at the same time within certain delegated boundaries, and then also focusing on where potentially the risk is and where they can go wrong, the failure modes. And
and it's not just governance or policy failure. I mean, I just wrote about the Anthropic leak, quote unquote leak, which is really just a system failure, because of the way they structure Claude. And I also wrote about constitutional AI, which is their framework for how to train their model. And so folks, if you haven't looked at those, they're coming out in our newsletter today. They're on our website as of yesterday. You can read those when this podcast comes out on Tuesday. But I mean, AI is moving into execution, not just analysis. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. So I think a recurring keynote thread that we've pulled together, in fact, you pulled together, Christina, was about visibility. So move from actionability to visibility. So
we've got these agents doing a heck of a lot of action, but can we see what they're doing? Right? Yeah. And how is that impacting SIM and SOC and MDR for that matter?
If we are going to have an agentic SOC at any point in the future, which is reliable, which is governable, which is predictable, which, as they say, wash its own face. If we're looking at something that we can account for and so on, then those things are important. You need to know what it's doing and why, and also what it's not doing, or if it is doing something bad, how to then stop it, or at least put it back on the right track.
Yeah, exactly. I think buyers are clamoring for, if you're going to talk about action, we want a closed loop response. We want automated enforcement, but we also want proof. We want provable outcomes. So operationalization is the new battleground, not just platformization, which we've been talking about for several years now, but how do you operationalize everything and include the proof points? And I thought that theme across the exhibitors, there were pieces and parts of it. Expel talked about the co-managed SIM, and we've seen others with co-managed SIM. We had briefings with folk like Ontinu, that are talking about an ongoing, continuous, just to put their words together, autonomous or automated SOC. And so, we were looking at their offering. They're a Microsoft partner. And I hope they show us and others more of their metrics around time to accuracy, time to response that is not just MTTR. There needs to be a new autonomous SOC metric. And that's what we were talking about with them in our chat at RSAC.
But
so anyway, we're all thinking about this stuff. How do you measure this?
How do you measure this? All the technologies we've seen introduced over the course of our careers, it's eventually come down to that, right? For cloud, it was the same. Initially, it was, wow, look at this. You can store stuff. Wow, look at this. It can do it for you. And it's just a virtual machine. And then eventually it shifts to, well, how does this build that into our cost base? What is the profit and loss associated with this? How can we operationalize it? How can we predict it? How can we standardize on it and have policies and processes? So it's the same thing is happening now with when you were looking at AI and AI agents.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So what else did we see, Christina, and other themes?
Yeah. So Rory, the other thing that we saw was resilience. And one of the companies I think that is, well, they're new, and I've talked about them before, right? But one of the companies I think is doing an interesting thing with resilience is Spectrum Labs.
Yeah.
And so, we saw them a lot over the show. I attended something with them on, I guess it was Monday night, and then we had a briefing with them. And so we got to chat with them a bunch, and it's going well for them. They launched in October. Their breed of resilience is not the old risk management conversation of, GRC or governance, risk, and compliance. It's more, how do you prove that your controls are properly configured, that you've stood up what you say you have implemented, and you're not just grabbing a screenshot or showing, an email of this is in place, but rather you have Spectrum putting a stamp of this has been validated, a token that says, yes, indeed, this control is in place, it's configured properly, and yes, we validate that it's there, so that you can prove it to your own, executives, your MDR provider, or your insurer, and also so you know where those controls are if and when, more likely when, you're in an incident. So resilience is changing color a little bit. What we saw at RSAC broadly was, well, assume that compromise is going to occur. And we've been in this place for a long time. But focused on continuity and recovery, and then this sort of national scale resilience by country. It's a pivot. It's how do you operate through the attack? How do you have the continuity?
Yeah, exactly. And I know, without going into great detail, when we've covered this in the past, some of the big, let's say, ransomware attacks and other DDoS attacks that we've reported on in the last, year and a half almost, from some of the large manufacturers and healthcare companies, the attacks happened, the business completely stops, or they are unable to operate.
Well,
attacks are going to happen, but what kind of attacks, and can we still operate through them? And it means you don't have these situations where, companies are significantly devalued, vast sums of money are having to be borrowed. It affects the GDP of whole countries, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly.
So we stop those things. So that, I think, to your point, and you've written about this before, people have to be much more open and clear about accepting that that's going to happen. It's going to happen. You can't say, well, we're going to stop everything. And certainly vendors who promise that are being kind of disingenuous. It's going to happen. How do you continue to operate while it's happening, while it's dealt with?
Well, and the really interesting conversation we had with Phoenix 24, FENIX 24, and we can't really say much because it was quite a lockdown NDA conversation, because they shared a lot of insight into what they do in recovery. So they're not a DFIR, DFIR, a forensics investigative company. They're more of a recovery. Let's get you back up and running. So we are going to have them on the podcast. That is coming up probably in May. We're working through a full briefing with them. and then we'll get them on to chat with us on the podcast. But take a look at them, because we like calling out these companies that are either little known to us or they're newer in the market, because there's some cool stuff out there. And we can't possibly, as cybersecurity market researchers or practitioners, we can't possibly keep our thumb on everything that's out there. So anyway, take a look at Phoenix 24, take a look at Spectrum Labs, as we mentioned, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what else? I mean, just to quickly sort of, tie this summary off, I think there's a constant tension we've seen around offense and defense. And I think, there's still that tension. It's shifting now to AI misuse and model exploit and systemic risk, like we mentioned with the Anthropic systemic challenge that they have had in the last couple of weeks. And then there's this, growing recognition of, the unknown unknowns in shadow AI and shadow-driven systems, right?
Yeah. And so much of it related to identity. I mean, we always keep coming back to identity, and people ask, what kind of areas are you guys still covering and still think, we should continue to delve deeply in? Its identity, because with autonomy and with agents comes, identity challenges and context and permissions and so on. And that's kind of paralleling these discussions about AI misuse and model exploitation, etc.
Yeah. So I think probably before we get to our wonderful guest for this week, the last thing that I would say that's really important to keep in mind while everyone's hair is on fire and they're worried about their jobs and the bots are taking over, not yet, and I'm not sure if ever, the human layer still matters. It may be that layer is being redefined. Definitely at RSAC, there was this heavy AI focus, and in spite of that, the keynotes continuously repeated that human judgment is critical. Behavioral defense, like Jordy AI, that was the winner of the sandbox, and they talk about behavioral defense in AI. And also the keynotes talked about organizational culture. But it's possible that instead of us being the operators, we're becoming the supervisor of the system, and that trust is shifting from, do I trust the analyst in my MDR or my MSSP and the analyst in my own SOC, to do I trust the system's decision? So we're the overlord of the machine, and we're applying our judgment and our insights into whether the machine is making the right decisions, which is an interesting shift, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely, there's a greater understanding that what humans may be challenged on in terms of the more mathematic and instant recall aspects of intelligence, which are being challenged by the AI and the bots out there, we make up for in wisdom. Wisdom being that overarching many years of multiple different discipline and systems knowledge, this multiplicity of ideas and concepts and philosophy all in one. We can take a judgment on things that the machines still can't. So that was my take on that.
Well, I thought it was a great show, but it's back, and it's a lovely community, and I'm so grateful that you were able to come. I was able to be there, and we saw so many friends and learned a ton. So, folks, if you haven't attended, try to attend in the future. If you want to know more of our thoughts, reach out. We'd love to talk more about it with you.
On this week's show, our special guest is former CIA officer, co-host of CISO Tradecraft podcast, and a CEO of Clear Capabilities, none other than Ross Young. Hi, Ross. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks again for having me here. It's such a pleasure to be on your show.
We're so excited to have you on, Ross. Really, Ross is a fellow security tinkerer, so props for that. And Ross also just published a book, which is fabulous, called Cybersecurity's Dirty Secret, Why Budgets Go to Waste, and, in parentheses, CISO Tradecraft, so a nod to his podcast. So we'll talk about that today, but also I have to do a humble bow to Ross,
Oh, yes.
because his podcast, CISO Tradecraft, we were just talking, has 277 episodes. They've been at this 5 years. We're like so humbled, Ross. Thank you for joining our little podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure. You know, I remember when I was first starting out, the big thing we kept saying is, you know, we need ways to mentor people to become CISOs. And I thought that was a really big gap. There was a lot of people who had talk news and they could talk about the vulns or hacks of the day. But how do you actually learn how to become a CISO? I thought there was a huge void. And so that's what we did. And, you know, I just love seeing all the other podcasts coming in, taking their unique approaches and where they want to go and help and mentor people.
Well, clearly that's great, and that clearly comes across in when you talk to you and so on. And just for the viewers and listeners, although of course it's just listeners at the moment, and maybe viewers in the future, I went to Ross's book signing at one of the locations near the RSAC show in San Francisco. And a bunch of people turned up. They were all very enthusiastic and very happy to chat. And I chatted to a bunch of them as well. Yeah, it was a
What did you say? You had like 75?
Yeah,
you had like 75 or something, Ross? Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Was such a great turnout. You know, I wrote the book because I hadn't seen anybody talk about the financial lens of being a CISO. How do you do a budget?
Right.
How do you do a murder board to figure out what projects you're going to get rid of? How do you do your strategy and all these financial things, or like negotiating with your vendors, and how do you do master service license agreements? So I was just so excited to meet a lot of folks, and probably the best, thing I would hear over and over is, "Hey Ross, I read your book. I love your book. And now it's required reading for all my directs, and I'm handing it out to other leaders." And when I hear things like that, it's like, oh my gosh, so cool.
Yeah.
It's great. It's great to see people getting this knowledge, because I think there's a lot more to learn than just getting your CISSP in the world, right?
Well, for me, and I've read most of it, it's very much like I would imagine the inside of an experienced CISO's brain. Lots of like tips and tricks, advice. I would say it's the kind of greybeard advice, Christina, that we've often talked about, this kind of wisdom that's imparted. I also particularly liked some of the sections, Ross, you've got that you don't see on every financial-oriented book, but you often see on, let's say, more technical books. But you have sections on acronyms, a glossary of terms. And for me, I think that should be mandatory in all books. It points to the educative slant that you've got for this book, right?
Yeah, in every chapter, I always wanted to have an executive summary. I wanted to have a chapter that was, usually less than 5 pages, so it didn't read like, an IEEE document where it's very PhD oriented. I wanted to be very practical, and then have like a summary of 5 steps to takeaways at the end of every chapter. And then I also really like including lots of pictures. So sorry if you got the Audible version. I highly recommend getting the Kindle version or the paperback.
I can attest to the fact, because you gave me one of you signed a copy for me, in fact, the paper copy. So that was awesome. Looking through, and it felt a bit strange. Everybody's looking at their devices, and I was looking at a paper book, which is a bit strange, but very good. I can attest to the fact that there is a lot of good visuals there, so I can recommend it. Now, one of the things that I liked, and then we'll go on to a few questions I've got, which will kind of take us into some of the broader discussions about cybersecurity that Christina and I have been talking about since episode 1 of the show. I really like the chapter called "How to Buy Software Without Selling a Kidney." That made me chuckle. And I'll tell you why it made me chuckle. It really took me back to my days in software sales when, I was on the other side of that, which was, how do we help customers to buy our software and make our number without them having to sell a kidney or give us a kidney? So it's really interesting. I thought that was a really good perspective, and a lot of it made sense and took me back. But you define it, cybersecurity, as the business of revenue protection. What kicked that off for you?
Yeah, so I just think it's a brilliant term, because at the end of the day, cyber costs money to implement, right? You have to pay for headcount, you have to pay for tools. And at the same time, we're usually protecting the organization by preventing an incident that takes money away from the organization. So really there's this happy medium of, well, how much should I spend in order to prevent this amount of loss?
Mm-hmm.
And so that business of revenue protection, I think, is key. Some people will say, oh, we need to spend more in cyber. And I would say, well, what's the risk tolerance of the organization? Because maybe they only view it as 7% of, the IT organizational costs are going to be directed towards cyber, or, this amount of the total ARR of the company. And so I think when you put that lens on it, it really helps you to understand that you're a business enabler. And at the same time, you also have to make sure you're not spending so much on cyber that you're harming the profitability of a publicly traded company, if you will.
It's good to hear that perspective, because so much of what we hear about is about the technical aspects or whatever, or at least the regulatory or compliance things, the things that, the kind of yes, but side. Do you think that the revenue protection part extends then, or part of that extends to things like reputational protection or, resiliency protection as part of that mission? Or do you think that this is quite an all-encompassing term, revenue protection? Because I guess they do. If reputation and resiliency is affected badly, then yeah, it hits your revenue as well.
So I think it makes a lot of sense, except for, let's say, government agencies that don't really make revenue, or nonprofit organizations,
Right.
At which case I usually say it's, the business of mission protection, because, your mission may not be to make money as a nonprofit, right? Now, when you talk about business resilience, there's another chapter in my book where I really dive into, hey, there's 4 things that a business is trying to do. The first is they're trying to increase the number of customers. Second is they might be trying to add a new profit line or new tool or product or service. And then the third is they may be trying to achieve larger margins. And then the last is they may be in a total, like a cost reduction mode. And when they're in that third mode of, hey, I need to increase my margins and do this, then I actually map that to business resilience as how cyber supports the organization.
Right.
So take the example of Capital One. It should come as no shocker to anybody that the majority of Capital One's revenue comes through their credit cards. And so I would say, hey, if I really want to do business resilience, how does somebody order a credit card? How does somebody pay for a credit card bill? And all of those supporting IT systems need to be super resilient so that we ensure protection of 80% of Capital One's revenues.
Some of that then kind of leads me on to one of the chapters and one of the sections I picked out. And I don't know if you can, it's just putting you on the spot here, but which chapter began with the quote from Michael Porter that says, "The essence of strategy is choosing what not to do"?
I think it's chapter 11, called Which Cyber Cuts Often Backfire and How to Cover Yourself with Risk Approvals.
Well done. You obviously know your book, which is good. It's a little bit like, those celeb interviews, and they say, what do you think of these lyrics? And there's some bizarre, strange lyric, and they say, oh, that's a really odd one. They say, well, you wrote it. Have you seen those interviews? So obviously you do know your stuff. And what you were saying about Capital One and so on, this idea of risk approvals, how do you protect yourself? How do you give yourself the permission, I think, as a CISO, to guard yourself from some of the implications?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest mistakes that we have in cybersecurity today is believing that the CISO owns cybersecurity for the company. And you would think, well, they're the chief information security. It sounds like they do, but I'll challenge that model a little bit. So the auditors in like the big 4 accounting companies have this concept known as the 3 lines of defense. The idea being that there's some person who owns a control. There's a second line who oversees, performance of that control. And third line is an independent auditor who assesses the overall program. Let me give you an example of this. Hey, the developer who writes code for the application is in charge of application security. They need to write good, clean code. Now, if that first control fails, then the second control, i.e. cyber, typically an AppSec organization, is going to scan it and say, hey, you have vulns in your code. You need to go fix these vulns. And then the developer, who's that first line control owner, is responsible for fixing it. Cyber isn't responsible for this app being vulnerable. Cyber is responsible for making sure they know to fix it and they know what the vulns are. They're not responsible for the IT application. And then ultimately you have the auditors who would look at the trends. Hey, month over month, we're seeing the number of vulns across this application go up, and it's not ever going down. We think this is a systemic risk that needs greater attention from the board or the leadership C-suite team. Otherwise, it could, potentially materially harm the company. So in this example, I think it's really clear where we can start to say cyber isn't truly responsible for cyber, because if the application was written securely, we'd be out of a job. But clearly, there is a really important need for oversight and governance and providing feedback to help those developers know where to fix.
And yet, the SEC did point an arrow at the back of the CISO, CEO and board. And so it's an interesting, I know we've had many discussions in our Tinkerer group about the SEC ruling several years ago that did point that arrow at the CISO. And we know why, and we know, what the intent was. In some ways, it's putting a target on the back of the CISO, but in other ways, it's also pressuring the CEO, the C-suite, and the board to get involved. What's your take on that today, Ross? I totally love what you're saying. I think it's a very grounded approach to say CISOs don't really own all of cybersecurity or all of the protection of the company. What's your take on that, the SEC ruling that we had a couple of years ago?
Yeah, so what I would say is at the end of the day, CISOs are responsible for declaring what the material threats from cybersecurity are to the executive leadership team and the directors, right?
Yeah.
So if I go in, I say, hey, I absolutely think phishing is a top risk at this company. Okay, they're going to say, well, what are we doing about that material risk? And then I have to come up with a phishing defense strategy that says, here's a set of safeguards, user training, other things we're putting in place so that we're mitigating this risk. Does that mean I can prevent every person in my company from clicking a phishing email? Absolutely not. But I am responsible for identifying the material risks and making sure we have a strategy to minimize those things going forward.
But also, I think it's getting the sign off on what risks are accepted risks. In my mind, it feels to me like the risk management discussion of, dear CEO, dear board, here are the mitigating factors on, your example of a phishing attack. And here's some mitigation, and I'm asking for this amount of money to go do this. And they say, well, we're not going to give you that much money because we're in growth mode and we're not going to invest that much into any of these tools right now because we're trying to really focus on revenue. And you go back and forth, and until finally, Mr. or Ms. CISO, I hope, would say to them, so you're willing to accept this amount of risk. And can I have that in writing, please? is my take on it. Is that naive? Is my take on it naive or silly?
No, I actually think that's the right way to do things. So we all know that if you spend more money, you can probably get a little bit better security. Just take the example of phishing. Most companies are going to buy an email security gateway. Think of something like a Proofpoint or Abnormal Security to secure their company. But you might actually go in and say, hey, you know what? We actually need a standalone browser, like an Island or a Talon to put, our users on a different place where if they get phished, the harm is minimized. And the organization is going to be like, yeesh, I just don't think we have $3 million in the budget for, this Island browser or whatever the tool is. It doesn't have to be them. And they're going to say, you know what, we're just not going to do that because we think it's more important to spend $3 million on marketing or sales or whatever the needs of the company are. And that's okay for their risk tolerance. Now, what I would always say is, one, is it illegal to not have this as a compliance requirement? Okay, maybe not illegal in this example. And then the second thing is, if they're saying we are not going to do this, how do we document this in the organization to say, look, I gave the company a $3 million offer, a $5 million offer, and a $7 million offer of how we're going to secure against phishing. They chose the $3 million option, perfectly fine. And they chose not to accept us performing these additional safeguards capabilities in order to use the money to do something else in the company. Then it's very transparent to say we made these decisions. And, if next year a phishing attack happens, they're going to be like, maybe we should have invested in this. But we know why we made the decision. We know who made the decision. And we know when to revisit the decision in case we decide to change our mind.
I like that. Yeah. Very grounded approach. Yeah.
So I wanted to move on to a topic that comes up in almost all, maybe in fact, actually all 100% of the conversations that we have with folk. And it's a word that rhymes with I. Oh, it's agentic AI. Yeah, sorry, we can't stay away from it. And again, in your book, you've got quite a thought-provoking chapter, which is called, Creating a Digital Workforce with Agentic AI, which one of the first chapters I read. Now, you start with a quote from the $6 Million Man. I thought that was interesting. Yeah, I remember that. Of it, men of a certain age, people of a certain age will remember that show, of course. We even got it over here. We used to run around in slow motion. Do, 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 do. But I won't say any more because we'll probably get a copyright strike. So,
what was his name? Steve something?
It was. I was about to say Steve Bannon. It's not Steve Bannon. No, that would be tricky if it was.
No.
Steve Austin, wasn't it?
Steve Austin. There you
go. So you wrote this book last year. So here's the question: you wrote this book last year, Ross, and we all know how quickly things are changing from a technology tools perspective and so on. How much do you think has changed since you wrote that chapter when it comes to the use of agentic AI in security today? What's your perspective?
So I think this is the way forward in how companies are changing. And I'll just give you the example of maybe 10, 15 years ago, we used to write out applications to work on-prem. And then from there, it was, hey, we're a cloud native company. I would say if you start to really look in 2026 and say, what are VCs looking at? They are looking at, we are an agentic native company. How do you build things where you don't have marketing officers doing marketing? You have marketing officers writing marketing agents that automate their efforts. That shift where everybody becomes a coder, everybody starts creating automation playbooks via agents is how we're going to do things cheaper, faster, better than ever before. And I'll just give you the example of the SOC. We built out SOAR technology, security orchestration, automation, response. What did it look like? We had really, really smart people in the SOC writing lots of alerts that says, if this, then that. If I see bad detection here, stop the attack. Problem is, they always came up with clever, novel attacks that we didn't have a script for. And our folks were infinitely busy writing these things. And the things change all the time. Now, talk about what happens in 2026. In 2026, I don't actually write a pattern, regex expression of how to find things. What I do is I write a goal or an intent for Claude Code or Google Gemini to search. And so that way, if the pattern changes, but they still know I'm trying to stop this MITRE technique, it's actually smarter and it's self-learning and it does things better. And this means our defenses are faster and more adaptive. And that's a really, really powerful concept. We saw, at least 40 vendors doing AI SOC capabilities in RSA showroom floor. So, I think this is just a great illustration of where the rest of cyber is going. How do we agentify compliance, data privacy, all of these other things that have hugely been manual process? Like having an agentic architect who can analyze code in 10 minutes and say, here's everything that's wrong. You don't even need to go to the architecture review board. And here's the Claude code that actually fixes what you wrote wrong. Those developers are like, wow, I can really move fast. And I love having agentic cyber to help me move fast.
So, and I know Christina has a a view on this. We both have a view, and coming off the back of RSIC, one of the things that we started to see, kind of what happened with cloud, right? We had a vast amount of hype around cloud, and we had cloud washing, right? We've had a vast amount of hype around the kind of re-emergence of AI through automation, but also agentic AI. And we're seeing a lot of agentic AI washing going on. Isn't there a danger in that kind of slightly blinkered approach if they are agentic native, if they are pushing that very strongly, that it kind of takes away from some of the evaluation of other technologies, or takes away from perhaps a hybrid approach to technology, security, or whatever?
So I'm going to give you a reason to do it and a reason to not do it. So the first reason I say to do it is I actually think AI is smarter than humans. And let me give you some examples. Take a developer who onboards into a programming team, and they have a code base of 10,000 lines of code. No way that developer understands every line of code in that software application. And so now as the GRC officer, you go to him and say, hey, tell me how you're doing all these things. He's going to make a best guess to fill out that compliance as truthful as he knows, but it's not accurate, right? There can be things he just won't know and won't understand in the code, and he'll miss. LLMs can analyze and understand every line of that code. So we can say, hey, how are you authenticating? It'll go in and it'll say, here's the exact lines of code where we're authenticating and meeting all of these, compliance requirements. So I think it's better. And we're seeing that right now where real good pen testers are saying Claude Code can pen test better than I can, even with 20 years of experience. Now, here's the caveat of what I would say. If you have a bad process and you automate that bad process, you're just making stupid faster, right? So before you go and build an agent and automate things, I think there's actually a process that you have to say, how do we document what we're doing? How do we actually optimize the process? Then we digitize it, then we automate it, and then from there we integrate it. And you kind of need to go down that flow because, like I said, doing stupid faster makes no sense to anybody.
It's potentially the title for your next book, isn't it? Which is How Not to Make Stupid Faster. And looking at hygiene, clear processes, etc. But Christina, I know you've got views on this of what we've just discussed.
Yeah, I've been having a wonderful backseat this week, and because Rory received your book, he has been reading it. The last thing that you mentioned here about doing stupid faster, and how you need to look at your workflow, you need to set your strategy first, essentially, and figure out the different parts of the framework, the different steps before you actually automate. Makes a ton of sense. And I wonder if we humans are going to do this well, because we have proven again and again that we don't like to go back to look at the strategy, to think about the security program, to work through the what ifs and the what can we affords, and where do we need to really focus our attention? And I'm not talking about the 20% of CISOs who really understand how security is a business enabler. I'm talking about the 80%. And I guess this is my thought, and also a question to you, is what kind of CISO do you want to be? Do you want to be a strategic and thoughtful CISO and, embracing this new technology? Because if you don't, I think we're left behind. If we don't embrace agentic coding, agentic process, agentic development, et cetera, we get left behind. So do you want to embrace this? And are you willing to do the hard human work up front? And so my question to you is, do you think we can do that?
I would say not only can we do it, we have to do it. And I'll just give you two examples here. The first example is we know bad actors are going to automate all of the things, right? On their offensive attacks. So if we're trying to respond in human time and they're attacking in machine time, we're just too slow. It won't work. It won't scale, right? If they can fully breach your system in 10 minutes or less, and I take a bathroom break longer than 10 minutes, clearly I'm not fast enough to respond, right? And
no
the
bathroom
second
breaks
thing,
for you, Ross.
and the second thing I would say is when we really think about this concept of agents, there's two things we're getting. We're getting speed, but the other one we're also getting is scale. And I'll just give you an example. When I was the divisional CISO at Capital One, I used to oversee anywhere from 100 to 200 different applications. And that's a lot. I didn't know and understand in depth every application. And at the end of the day, those applications were changing daily, weekly with their code bases. And I could spend all week and I could build a really good threat model on one of those applications, which would quickly become stale as that application code changed. And I wouldn't have done a threat model on the other 199 applications that I also needed to cover. And so I'm seeing this change and this focus to say, what if I could do a threat model on every application, on every code change? Something that we
all
probably
at
would,
once.
yeah, and do it in less than 10 minutes, right? And something that we would never have the headcount approval to go and hire 200 people to do this work. But if I can do it with one agent, and that agent costs, $50K compared to the average headcount of, $150K to $200K for a salary of a cyber professional, I think this is the capabilities we need to give our folks so that we can automate cybersecurity to move at the speed of automated software development.
Well, that's a really interesting perspective, and obviously you're drawing on many years of experience. Ross, we very much appreciate you coming on, and thanks for sharing your insights and some of your perspectives through your book, but also through examples from your working life, and we very much appreciate that. So listen, thanks very much, and we look forward to your next book, first of all, but we look forward to perhaps getting you back on the show again.
Yeah, I'd love to come back.
Awesome.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, Ross.
Bye-bye. Well, that was a great discussion with Ross. It's really interesting to hear how he went about pulling his book together, and also some of the concepts and ideas in there. And of course, Dirty Secrets, which was the subtitle for the book, is always thought-provoking and quite intriguing. And as I said, it kind of read like a kind of a brain dump of somebody who's extremely experienced in the security realm. Of course,
and he
is.
Yeah.
So I would encourage folk to check it out, even if you maybe read a sample chapter or something. Wealth of experience and great learnings to be had.
Cybersecurity's dirty secret, why most budgets go to waste. And it's very tactical. I mean, I love a good strategy book, and I think this does have strategic thoughts in it, but it's also very tactical about how to think about money, the budget in cybersecurity, and look at your ROI, where you can make changes or how budgets backfire on you. I mean, it's very tangible, approachable, and tactical. So thank you so much, Ross, for coming on. We're so pleased that you could join us, and check out his book, folks.
Right, so with that, we should probably wrap up the show. Thanks everybody for listening. Thanks for your continued support, feedback, comments, etc. To get hold of us, probably easiest by email, and that would be me, which is Rory at richmondadvisorygroup.com, or
Christina at richmondadvisorygroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. Please do reach out. Give us your thoughts and insights and feedback.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to you joining us again next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.